I stopped by my wife's private psychiatric clinic to surprise her with the briefcase she left on the kitchen counter. Her receptionist told me to wait in her office while she finished a consultation. As I stood by her massive oak desk, I noticed a heavy silver fountain pen. It caught my eye because it was engraved with my daughter's initials. Curious, I picked it up and twisted the cap. A heavy mechanical click echoed through the room. The solid mahogany wall behind her bookshelf smoothly slid open. I froze in absolute disbelief. My daughter, who had been missing for over a year, was sitting on a bare cot inside a windowless concrete cell. She was terrifyingly thin, trembling, and staring at me with hollow eyes. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever discovered a betrayal so deep it changed you forever. I stepped across the threshold of the hidden room. The air inside felt heavy, artificially chilled, and reeked of strong clinical antiseptic mixed with the metallic scent of fear. I am 66 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years designing maximum security commercial vaults and reinforced foundations. My brain instantly analyzed the environment out of pure habit before the emotional horror could paralyze me. The walls were lined with 4-inch thick acoustic dampening foam, seamlessly integrated behind a layer of reinforced drywall. The lighting was recessed and shielded behind shatterproof polycarbonate. This was not a makeshift closet. This was a custom-built, heavily funded holding cell engineered for permanent isolation. I looked down at the cot. My beautiful daughter Maya was curled into a tight ball. A year ago, my wife Diana told me Maya had suffered a severe relapse. Diana told me Maya emptied her bank accounts and ran away to live on the streets. I spent 12 agonizing months driving through the worst neighborhoods in the city, handing out flyers, begging strangers for information, crying myself to sleep, while Diana rubbed my back and told me we had to accept the tragedy. Now Maya was right in front of me. Her skin was ashen and bruised. Her long dark hair was matted and falling out in clumps. She wore a standard-issue gray clinical scrub suit that hung loosely on her emaciated frame. Her wrists bore the unmistakable dark red rings of thick leather restraints. She looked up at me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then she let out a broken, raspy whisper. She called me Dad. My knees nearly buckled. The wave of grief that hit me was a physical blow to my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the walls down with my bare hands. I took a step toward her, reaching out my shaking hands to pull her into my arms. I wanted to carry her out of this nightmare and burn the clinic to the ground. But as I took that step, my eyes caught a detail on the inside of the doorframe. It was a secondary biometric locking mechanism. It required a retinal scan to open from the inside. Even if I dragged her out right now, the clinic was swarming with Diana's private security contractors. They were heavily armed and aggressively loyal to my wife. I would never make it to the elevator. Worse, Diana was the director of this facility. She had the legal authority to place anyone under a psychiatric hold. If I caused a scene, she would simply drug me and claim I was having a senior dementia episode. The realization washed over me like freezing water. The woman I had slept next to for 30 years was the architect of this horror. Before my fingers could even brush against Maya's shoulder, a sharp rhythmic sound echoed from the hallway outside the office. It was the unmistakable click of Diana's designer heels striking the marble floor. She was walking fast. She was coming back. Pure panic spiked through my veins. The engineering side of my brain took complete control, overriding the terrified father. I had less than 10 seconds. I looked down at Maya. Her eyes widened in absolute terror at the sound of those footsteps. She began to hyperventilate, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. I dropped to one knee and grabbed her cold, trembling hands. I squeezed them hard to ground her. I looked directly into her sunken eyes and forced my face to remain perfectly calm. I did not speak a single word. I simply gave her a look that communicated everything. I promised her silently that I was not leaving her to die here. I placed a single finger over my lips, demanding absolute silence. Maya understood. A single tear rolled down her bruised cheek, but she nodded and pressed her hand over her own mouth. I let go of her hands. The physical pain of stepping backward away from my trapped child was worse than any injury I had ever sustained. I stepped out of the hidden cell and back into the opulent warmth of Diana's office. I reached for the silver fountain pen on the desk. I twisted it in the opposite direction. The heavy mechanical gears hummed to life. The mahogany bookshelf began to slide shut. I watched the gap narrow, keeping my eyes locked on Maya until the very last second. The wall locked into place with a solid, definitive thud just as the brass handle of the office door began to turn. I quickly shoved my hands into the pockets of my slacks to hide their violent shaking. I forced my breathing to slow down. I pasted a pleasant, ignorant smile on my face. The office door swung open. Diana walked in, her immaculate white coat flowing behind her. Her hair was perfectly styled and her expensive perfume instantly overpowered the lingering smell of the sterile cell. She smiled when she saw me, a warm, practiced expression that I had trusted for decades. She walked over, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed my cheek. Her lips felt like dry ice against my skin. I had to summon every ounce of willpower in my body not to wrap my hands around her throat. I chuckled an empty, hollow sound and gently pulled back. I pointed to the leather briefcase sitting on her visitor chair. I told her she had forgotten it on the kitchen island this morning, and I knew she had that important board meeting this afternoon. Diana sighed dramatically, rubbing her temples. She thanked me profusely, calling me her lifesaver. She walked behind her desk, completely ignoring the fountain pen, and sat down in her high-backed leather chair. She gestured for me to sit across from her. She offered me a cup of coffee from her espresso machine. I nodded and sat down in the plush chair. I was sitting mere inches away from the hidden door. I could almost feel the cold radiating from the wall. Diana poured the coffee and handed me a delicate porcelain cup. I took a sip. It tasted like ash, but I swallowed it and complimented the roast. She leaned back, crossing her legs, and asked me how my morning was going. The psychological torture of the next 10 minutes was excruciating. I had to look into the eyes of a monster and discuss mundane household chores. I told her I was planning to clean the gutters this weekend. I asked her if she wanted to invite our neighbors over for a barbecue on Sunday. Every word that came out of my mouth was a carefully calculated lie. I watched her face closely. I observed the way she nodded sympathetically, the way she maintained perfect eye contact, the way she mirrored my relaxed posture. It was flawless. For 30 years, I believed she was a compassionate, dedicated healer. Now, viewing her through the lens of the truth, I saw the sociopathy beneath the surface. She was a master architect of deception. She complained about the stress of managing the clinic, citing the high turnover rate of her nursing staff and the difficult behavior of her severe patients. She said it took a heavy toll on her heart. I agreed with her. I told her she worked too hard and needed to take better care of herself. I even reached across the desk and patted her hand. Her skin was warm, soft, and completely oblivious to the fact that I knew her secret. I realized in that moment that confronting her would be a fatal mistake. If she suspected for a second that I knew about the hidden room, Maya would disappear forever. Diana would have her moved to an offshore facility by midnight, and I would suffer a convenient fatal heart attack in my sleep. I had to be smarter than her. I had to dismantle her foundation from the inside out. I finished my coffee, set the cup down, and stood up. I told her I needed to get back home to meet the plumbers. She stood up, kissed me goodbye again, and told me she would be home late for dinner. I smiled and told her I would leave a plate warm for her. I walked out of her office. I closed the door behind me, feeling the heavy click of the latch. I walked down the brightly lit corridor of the clinic. Nurses in crisp uniforms nodded politely at me. Security guards in tailored black suits held the elevator doors open for me. I smiled at all of them. I played the role of the friendly, wealthy, retired husband perfectly. The elevator descended to the underground parking garage. The soft elevator music mocked the screaming rage inside my head. The doors parted. I stepped out into the cool, damp air of the concrete garage. I walked to my car, a heavy vintage sedan I had restored myself. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the heavy door shut. The thick glass cut off the sounds of the outside world. I sat in the silence for exactly 3 seconds, then the facade shattered. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel. I hit the leather so hard my knuckles split open. I let out a raw, guttural scream that tore at my throat. I gasped for air, tears streaming down my face, my entire body violently shaking as the shock finally caught up with me. I wept for my daughter. I wept for the months of torture she had endured while I slept comfortably in a warm bed just miles away. I wept for the destruction of my marriage and the absolute annihilation of my reality. I let the breakdown wash over me, giving the pain complete control for 5 minutes. I cried until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. Then I stopped. I took a deep, ragged breath. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a clean microfiber cloth. I wiped the tears from my face. I wiped the blood from my knuckles. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The grieving, confused old man was gone. The engineer was back. I understood how structures were built, and I knew exactly how to find their weak points. Diana had built an empire on lies, extortion, and human suffering. She believed her wealth and her security forces made her untouchable. She believed I was just a harmless, retired old man who spent his days tinkering in the garage. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I put the car in gear and drove out of the garage, leaving the clinic behind. I was not going to call the police. I was not going to hire a private investigator. I was going to tear Diana's life apart piece by piece. I was going to sever her resources, expose her crimes, and watch her entire world collapse into dust. I was going to get my daughter back, and I was going to destroy every single person who had a hand in putting her in that room. The war had officially begun, and I was going to win it in absolute silence. I drove through the wrought iron gates of my estate. The meticulously landscaped driveway was lined with imported oak trees. The house itself was a sprawling, modern marvel of glass and stone. I had personally designed the structural supports 10 years ago, building a sanctuary for my family to grow old in. Now, looking at the floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the afternoon sun, I saw only a beautifully constructed lie. I parked my vintage sedan in the 4-car garage and cut the engine. The silence inside the garage was heavy. I checked my watch. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The housekeeper always left at noon on Tuesdays, and Diana had board meetings until 6. I had exactly 4 hours to dismantle the first layer of her fortress. I walked into the house. My footsteps echoed on the imported marble floors. The air conditioning hummed softly. Everything was perfectly in its place. Crystal vases, expensive contemporary art, pristine leather furniture. It made me sick to my stomach. I walked straight past the living room and headed down the east corridor toward Diana's private home office. She always kept it locked, claiming she needed absolute confidentiality for her patient files. The lock on her door was a heavy deadbolt. I did not bother looking for the spare key. I went to the utility closet, retrieved a set of tension wrenches from my old tool bag, and picked the lock in less than 30 seconds. I stepped into her office and closed the door behind me. The room smelled faintly of her expensive perfume. I ignored the massive mahogany desk and walked directly to the far wall. An oversized framed abstract painting hung exactly in the center. I lifted the heavy frame off its reinforced hooks and set it carefully on the floor. Behind it sat a flush-mounted brushed steel wall safe. It was a beautiful piece of hardware. I knew exactly what model it was because Diana had asked for my recommendation when she bought it 5 years ago. It featured a dual authentication system, a biometric fingerprint scanner on the right, and a complex mechanical rotary dial on the left. Furthermore, it was hardwired into an independent security network. If forced open, or if the wrong code was entered 3 times, it would not sound a loud siren. Instead, it would send a silent, encrypted distress signal directly to the private security firm guarding her clinic. They would arrive in heavily armored vehicles within 8 minutes. I was not going to force it. I was going to dissect it. I walked back to my garage workshop and gathered the specific instruments I needed. A digital multimeter, a spool of conductive copper wire, a specialized micro-vibration sensor, a portable oscilloscope, and a can of compressed air. I carried the tools back to her office and laid them out on her pristine carpet with surgical precision. The first obstacle was the biometric scanner. I could not replicate her fingerprint, so I had to make the locking mechanism believe the scanner had sent the approval signal. I knelt down and carefully removed the wooden baseboard directly beneath the safe. I had routed the electrical wiring for this room myself. I knew exactly where the low-voltage data cable for the safe ran. I found the thin blue wire, carefully stripped a tiny section of the insulation, and clamped the leads of my multimeter to the exposed copper. I needed to send a specific voltage spike to the logic board to mimic a successful scan. I connected my portable battery pack, adjusted the output dial to exactly 3.3 volts, and pulsed the connection. A tiny green light flashed on the safe control panel. The logic board had accepted the bypass. The biometric lock disengaged with a soft mechanical click. The second obstacle was the mechanical dial. This was pure mechanics, a language I spoke fluently. I attached the micro-vibration sensor to the steel faceplate of the safe directly above the dial. I plugged the sensor into my portable oscilloscope and turned on the small screen. Instead of listening for the tumblers to fall with a stethoscope like a common thief, I was going to read the friction. I grasped the cold titanium dial and began to turn it incredibly slowly. Every time a wheel inside the lock brushed against the drive cam, the friction created a microscopic vibration. The oscilloscope translated those vibrations into a jagged green line on the screen. I turned the dial clockwise. The green line stayed relatively flat. Then a sharp spike appeared on the graph. The first number was 24. I reversed direction, turning counterclockwise. The tension in my neck muscles tightened. One slip, one fast movement, and the internal relocker would trigger, permanently freezing the bolts. I watched the screen. Another friction spike. 47. I breathed out slowly, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. I turned the dial clockwise again. The third number registered at 12. I turned it counterclockwise one final time until the dial stopped completely at 89. The tumblers were perfectly aligned. However, I could not pull the handle yet. The final defense mechanism was a magnetic tamper switch located inside the doorframe. If the door opened without the central processor logging a legitimate sequence, the magnetic field would break and the silent alarm would transmit. I needed to bridge that magnetic field before I pulled the door open. I took a piece of razor-thin conductive foil from my toolkit. I slid it carefully into the microscopic gap between the heavy steel door and the frame, positioning it exactly over the internal magnetic sensor. I taped the foil in place to ensure the circuit remained closed, even when the physical door moved. I took a deep breath. I gripped the heavy steel handle of the safe. I pressed down. The locking bolt slid back with a heavy, satisfying thud. I pulled the door open. No alarm sounded. My phone did not ring. The house remained dead silent. The engineering bypass was a complete success. I looked inside the dark cavity of the safe. It was not filled with jewelry or cash. It was filled with thick manila folders, bound leather ledgers, and external hard drives. This was the true foundation of Diana's empire. This was where she kept the architecture of her crimes. I reached inside, pulled out the largest stack of documents, and carried them over to her desk. I turned on her reading lamp and opened the first folder. I was ready to find out exactly why my daughter had been erased from the world. I sat in the heavy leather chair behind my wife's desk and spread the stolen documents across the smooth mahogany surface. The silence of the empty house felt suffocating as I opened the first manila folder. It contained the private financial ledgers for her psychiatric clinic. I am accustomed to reading complex structural blueprints, so deciphering financial columns was second nature to me. It only took me 5 minutes to see the glaring structural flaws in her business. Diana was projecting the image of a wildly successful medical director, but the reality was a crumbling foundation. The clinic was severely over-leveraged. She had taken out massive predatory loans to fund her lavish lifestyle, her designer wardrobe, and the very house I was sitting in. She was drowning in millions of dollars of hidden corporate debt. She was desperate. But desperation alone did not explain why she would lock her own daughter in a concrete box. I pushed the financial ledgers aside and picked up a thick document bound in dark blue leather. My blood ran cold the moment I saw the gold-embossed seal on the cover. It was the seal of my family's old estate law firm. I opened the heavy cover. It was a certified copy of my late father's final will and testament. My father was a brilliant, unforgiving man who built a massive fortune in commercial real estate. He passed away 10 years ago. During his final days, he pulled me close to his hospital bed and told me that my wife was a parasite. He warned me that Diana loved my earning potential and my social standing, not my soul. I was so blinded by my loyalty to her that I actually argued with a dying man. I defended her honor and told him he was being cruel and paranoid. Now sitting in her pristine office, I realized my father possessed a vision I severely lacked. The bitter truth of his warning burned in my chest. I had failed to protect my own child because I refused to see the monster sleeping in my own bed. I turned the thick parchment pages of the will. My father had known exactly what he was doing. He completely bypassed me and Diana in the inheritance structure. He liquidated his entire commercial portfolio and deposited exactly $15 million into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. He named only one beneficiary to receive this immense fortune: my daughter Maya. I read the intricate legal clauses detailing the transfer of the funds. My father wanted to ensure Maya was mature enough to handle that kind of wealth, so he attached a strict age requirement. Maya could not access a single penny of the $15 million until the exact date of her 30th birthday. Before that day, the money was trapped behind an impenetrable wall of corporate lawyers and banking regulations. No one could touch it, not even Maya herself. I slowly lowered the document and looked at the silver digital calendar sitting on the corner of Diana's desk. Maya turns 30 next Thursday. That is exactly 1 week from today. The horrifying architecture of my wife's plan instantly snapped into perfectly clear focus. I felt physically sick as the sheer magnitude of her greed washed over me. I had to grip the edge of the desk to stop my hands from shaking. If Maya simply ran away and disappeared, as Diana had claimed a year ago, the $15 million would remain permanently locked in legal probate. A missing person cannot claim a trust fund. Diana would get nothing. And if Maya received the money on her birthday, she would undoubtedly use it to escape Diana's controlling grip forever. Diana needed Maya alive, but she needed her entirely powerless. I realized exactly what the end game was. If a person is declared legally and permanently incapacitated by a licensed medical professional, the state will assign a permanent legal guardian to manage their life and their finances. Diana is the highly respected director of a luxury psychiatric facility. She has the exact medical credentials required to write that devastating evaluation and present it to a judge. She has been keeping Maya locked in that soundproof cell for 12 months. She has been heavily medicating her, systematically breaking her mind and destroying her physical health. She is holding her hostage until her 30th birthday arrives next week. Once the trust unlocks, Diana will present her forged medical evaluations to the court. Declare our daughter completely insane, assume total guardianship, and legally absorb the $15 million to save her crumbling clinic. My wife was not just a kidnapper. She was a financial predator executing a flawless long-term strategy. I closed the leather binder. The shock was entirely gone. Only a cold, absolute resolve remained. I carefully placed my father's will back into its leather binder and reached for the final stack of manila envelopes sitting in the dark cavity of the wall safe. These folders were unusually thick, sealed with red tamper-evident tape, and stamped with the official crest of Diana's private psychiatric clinic. I peeled the heavy tape back and opened the first folder. Inside were dozens of weekly medical evaluation sheets. At the top of every single page, printed in stark black ink, was my daughter's name. I stared at the dates in absolute horror. These were not old records from before Maya supposedly vanished. The most recent clinical entry was dated yesterday afternoon. The typewritten notes detailed heavy doses of synthetic sedatives, the use of physical leather restraints, and documented severe cognitive degradation. Reading the clinical descriptions of my daughter's daily suffering made my stomach twist into painful knots. But what completely shattered my understanding of the situation was the legal authorization attached to the back of the medical file. In our state, a medical facility cannot forcibly hold and heavily drug an adult patient for an extended period without a designated legal medical proxy actively signing off on the treatment plan. Someone had to be officially authorizing Diana to keep Maya locked in that concrete cell. I flipped to the final authorization page, bracing myself to see a forged signature of my own name. Instead, I saw a signature that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was written in sharp, confident strokes. The signature belonged to Cameron. Cameron is my son-in-law, the man Maya married 3 years ago. For the past 12 months, Cameron has come to my house every single Sunday for dinner. He would sit at my dining table, look me directly in the eyes, and cry over his missing wife. I vividly remember a rainy evening 6 months ago, when Cameron broke down in my living room. I held that young man as he sobbed into my shoulder, telling me his life was empty without Maya. I felt so incredibly sorry for him. I paid his mortgage when he claimed he was too depressed to maintain his job. I paid for his expensive private therapy sessions to help him cope with the trauma of losing his wife. I treated him like my own blood. I defended him when my friends suggested he should move on. And every single week after eating the food I cooked and quietly accepting the money I gave him, he would drive across town to Diana's clinic and sign legal documents authorizing the continued chemical torture of his own wife. The sheer magnitude of their evil alliance was almost too massive to comprehend. I sat in the silent, perfectly decorated office, picturing my wife and my son-in-law sitting across from each other in the clinic, drinking expensive coffee and casually signing away my daughter's sanity. Cameron was not a tragic victim of circumstance. He was a fully complicit, eager partner in this monstrous enterprise. Looking at the signatures, the brutal logic of their partnership made perfect sense. Diana needed a legally recognized proxy to legitimize the psychiatric hold without raising red flags with state health inspectors. As Maya's legal husband, Cameron was the first in line for medical authority. In exchange for providing his signature and playing the role of the abandoned spouse, Diana was undoubtedly promising him a massive cut of the $15 million trust fund once they seized it next week. They had played me for an absolute fool. They used my deep paternal empathy as a weapon against me, keeping me constantly distracted with fake grief while they quietly built an inescapable legal cage around my child. The rage that boiled up inside me was no longer hot and chaotic. It was freezing cold, mechanical, and entirely focused. I did not want to just stop them anymore. I wanted to completely obliterate their existence. I pushed the sickening medical evaluations aside and picked up the very last document sitting at the bottom of the safe. It was printed on thick, formal legal stationery. It was a court summons for a closed-door private arbitration hearing. The legal petition was jointly filed by Diana and Cameron. The document formally requested that a judge declare Maya entirely mentally incompetent and permanently transfer full legal and financial guardianship to her mother and her husband. I looked down at the scheduled date and time stamped in bold red ink at the bottom of the page. The hearing was scheduled for next Tuesday at 9 o'clock in the morning. That is exactly 5 days from today. The ticking clock had officially started. I had exactly 120 hours to dismantle a conspiracy that took them a year to build. I had to bypass a multi-million-dollar security system, extract my daughter safely, and gather enough irrefutable evidence to destroy them in open court before that judge could sign the final decree. If I failed, Maya would be legally erased, and they would win everything. I carefully gathered every single document, ledger, and medical file. I took my phone out of my pocket and photographed every page, ensuring the flash was off. Once I had a complete digital copy of their crimes, I placed the files exactly as I found them, closed the heavy steel door of the safe, and reset the biometric lock. I wiped down the dial and replaced the abstract painting on the wall. The room looked completely undisturbed. They had no idea that their entire foundation was about to collapse. I walked out of the house, pulled my phone back out, and dialed a number I had not called in years. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery. I walked down the crumbling concrete steps into the subterranean belly of the city. The air in the subway station was thick, heavy with the smell of ozone, burnt rubber, and damp iron. Trains roared past every few minutes, violently shaking the platform and drowning out all other noise in a deafening mechanical scream. This was exactly why I chose this specific location. My wife Diana had the financial resources to tap my phone, track my vehicle, and hire private investigators to watch my usual high-end social spots. She would never expect her wealthy, supposedly docile, retired husband to be standing in the grime of the public transit system during the peak of rush hour. I stood near the edge of the platform, leaning against a tiled pillar, watching the blur of exhausted faces moving past me. I was waiting for Bradley. Bradley was not a gentle family lawyer or a friendly neighborhood attorney. He was a vicious, highly paid corporate litigator. We used to play high-stakes poker together every Friday night before I retired. He was a man who understood how to dismantle rival corporations, freeze assets, and bankrupt billionaires without leaving a single paper trail. During those long nights at the card table, I learned that Bradley possessed a rare type of ruthlessness. He did not care about playing nice. He only cared about winning. Right now, I needed a shark. Bradley was the biggest, most dangerous predator I knew, and I needed his fangs. A sudden rush of warm, stale wind announced the arrival of the next train. The doors opened, spilling a massive sea of commuters onto the platform. Through the chaotic crowd, I spotted him immediately. Bradley was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in the underground filth. He carried a slim leather briefcase and had a permanent, intimidating scowl etched into his face. He walked over to me, checking his expensive watch with clear irritation. He raised his voice over the noise, asking me why I had dragged him down into this metal tube instead of meeting at our usual country club lounge. I did not waste time with apologies or small talk. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I opened the encrypted photo gallery and handed the device to him. I told him to look at the documents I had just extracted from my wife's biometric wall safe. Bradley adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He swiped through the first few images of the clinic's financial ledgers. He let out a low whistle, muttering that Diana was entirely financially ruined, buried in millions of dollars of predatory corporate debt. Then he swiped to the next set of images, the medical evaluations. I watched the color completely drain from his face. The cynical, untouchable corporate shark disappeared, replaced by genuine, unadulterated horror. He read the cold, clinical descriptions of my daughter being chemically restrained and psychologically broken. He looked at Cameron's signature, authorizing the torture. He looked at the court summons for the private arbitration hearing, scheduled for next Tuesday, the exact legal mechanism they planned to use to steal Maya's $15 million trust fund. He slowly lowered the phone. He looked at me, his voice trembling, slightly, barely audible over the screeching brakes of another arriving train. He asked me if my daughter was actually locked inside that clinic right now. I nodded once. I told him I wanted to call the federal authorities immediately. I wanted heavily armed SWAT teams to kick down the reinforced doors of the clinic today and drag Diana out in handcuffs. Bradley shook his head violently. He grabbed my arm and pulled me closer to the tiled wall away from the constant flow of the crowd. He looked me dead in the eyes and told me that calling the police was the absolute worst thing I could possibly do. It would be a guaranteed death sentence for Maya. He explained the terrifying reality of the legal system that Diana had so brilliantly weaponized against us. Diana was not just an ordinary doctor. She was a prominent political donor. She sat on the state medical board. She routinely dined with the police commissioner and local judges. If I called the police, they would not send a SWAT team. They would send a polite, high-ranking liaison officer to ask her a few routine questions. Diana would smile, offer them coffee, and simply show them the legally binding medical proxy signed by Cameron Maya's own legal husband. She would show them the forged, highly detailed psychiatric evaluations stating Maya was a violent suicidal threat to herself and others. Bradley explained the chilling nature of medical hold laws. In our state, if a licensed facility director and a legal spouse agree that a patient is a danger, the police have absolutely no authority to intervene or demand a physical inspection of the premises. The police would be forced to respect the medical hold and walk away. Bradley tightened his grip on my arm. He explained that the very moment the police showed up and asked questions, Diana would know I had discovered her secret. She would realize her $15 million prize was at risk. She would not hesitate. She would immediately inject Maya with a lethal dose of synthetic opioids and claim it was a tragic, unavoidable suicide by a severely depressed patient. She would be completely protected by patient confidentiality laws and her husband's complicit silence. We had no legal grounds to force an inspection, and we had exactly 5 days before a judge gave her absolute legal control over my daughter's life. The reality of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The law was not designed to protect my daughter in this highly specific scenario. The law was an iron shield actively protecting her captors. I looked at Bradley. The noise of the subway faded into the background. I told him that if we could not use the law to save her, we had no choice but to break it. I told him I needed to physically extract Maya from that concrete cell before Tuesday morning. Bradley stared at me. He was a man who lived his entire life within the safe, structured boundaries of the courtroom. But looking into my eyes, he saw that I was absolutely serious. I was a desperate father, a trained engineer, and a man with nothing left to lose. He took a deep, steadying breath. He told me that if we were going to commit a highly coordinated felony kidnapping to save her, we needed an airtight, flawless strategy. We could not just walk through the front doors of a heavily fortified private medical facility. We needed a ghost operation. I told him I already possessed the blueprint. I reminded him that I was the structural engineer who designed and poured the clinic's foundation 15 years ago. I knew exactly where the blind spots were located. I knew how the biometric security systems operated because I had supervised their installation. But I needed someone on the inside to disable the central surveillance loop. I told Bradley about the clinic's head of security, a mercenary named Gage. I explained that I had secretly been monitoring the clinic's server traffic from my home office and possessed undeniable digital proof that Gage was embezzling thousands of dollars from the payroll accounts. Bradley's eyes sharpened instantly. The ruthless corporate litigator returned to the surface. He understood the absolute power of leverage. He told me I had to corner Gage outside the clinic and force him to create a 3-minute window of absolute darkness in the security system. While Gage blinded the cameras, I would breach the facility, bypass the locks, and pull Maya out. Bradley promised to use his underworld contacts to secure an unmarked private ambulance and a team of loyal, highly paid medical contractors who would treat Maya and never ask questions. We stood in the noisy, filthy subway station and finalized a surgical plan to tear down my wife's impenetrable empire. The ticking clock was screaming in my ears. The meeting was over. It was time to go to work. I parked my vintage sedan 2 blocks away from a high-end sports bar downtown. The rain was coming down hard, blurring the neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I sat in the darkness of my car watching the front entrance through a pair of compact binoculars. I was waiting for Gage. Gage was the head of private security for my wife's psychiatric clinic. He was a former military contractor with a reputation for brutality and absolute discretion. Diana hired him because he asked no questions and followed orders perfectly. But I knew something about Gage that Diana did not. I knew he was arrogant, and arrogant men always have a fatal weakness. Right on schedule at exactly 11 o'clock at night, the heavy wooden doors of the bar swung open. Gage walked out flanked by two other men in expensive suits. He was laughing loudly, smoking a thick cigar, and holding the keys to a brand-new imported sports car parked illegally by the curb. I watched him tip the valet with a $100 bill. I lowered the binoculars. A head of security at a private medical facility makes a very comfortable salary, but they do not make enough to drive a $200,000 car and hand out $100 bills for fun. Gage was living significantly beyond his legal means. I did not need to follow him home. I already had the thread I needed to pull. I put the car in drive and headed back to my empty estate. I walked straight into my home office and locked the door behind me. I turned on my desktop computer. It was a custom-built machine with multiple encrypted drives completely isolated from the main network of the house. I poured myself a glass of cold water, sat down in my leather chair, and cracked my knuckles. I was about to break into the main server of my wife's clinic. Diana believed her digital security was impenetrable. She paid a premium technology firm thousands of dollars every month to monitor the firewalls and encrypt the patient databases. What the technology firm did not know was that 15 years ago, I personally wired the entire server room when I designed the clinic's physical foundation. I knew the exact layout of the data cables. More importantly, I had secretly installed a hardware bypass router directly into the main trunk line during the final phase of construction. It was a simple diagnostic backdoor I put in place to monitor the building's automated climate and structural stress sensors. I never told Diana about it. At the time, I thought I was just being a diligent engineer, protecting my architectural investment. Over the years, that forgotten piece of hardware became an invisible bridge straight into the heart of her secure network. I opened a secure terminal on my computer. I typed in the specific IP address of my hidden router. The screen blinked black, then presented a command prompt. I bypassed the clinic's external firewall entirely because my connection was coming from inside the building's own structural framework. I was essentially a ghost walking through solid walls. I ignored the medical records database. I did not care about the patient files right now. I navigated directly to the administrative sector. I targeted the primary payroll and vendor accounting ledgers. I downloaded the past 3 years of the clinic's financial transactions onto an encrypted flash drive. The files were massive, filled with thousands of lines of raw data. I opened a spreadsheet analysis program I used to calculate structural load bearings. I applied the exact same mathematical logic to the flow of money. I instructed the program to highlight any recurring payments made to private security vendors that did not match the official state contractor registry. The program scanned the data for 5 tense minutes. The only sound in the room was the heavy beating of my own heart. Then the screen flooded with highlighted red text. The structural flaw in Gage's operation was immediately obvious. He was a brute, not an accountant. He had created 3 phantom security consultancy firms. Every single month he was approving massive invoices for specialized training and equipment upgrades that never actually existed. The money was being automatically routed from the clinic's operating budget directly into 3 offshore bank accounts. Gage was systematically bleeding my wife's company dry, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars right under her nose. I clicked on the digital signatures attached to the fraudulent invoices. Every single one bore Gage's unique employee authorization code. It was absolute, undeniable proof of grand larceny and corporate fraud. If Diana saw these documents, she would not just fire Gage. She would use her political connections to have him thrown into a maximum security federal prison for the rest of his natural life. Gage had built a comfortable, luxurious life on stolen money, and now I held the detonator to his entire world. I felt a cold wave of satisfaction wash over me. I was not just a grieving father anymore. I was a predator tracking my prey. I loaded my desktop printer with high-quality paper. I selected the most damning invoices, the offshore routing numbers, and the corresponding authorization codes. I hit print. The machine hummed to life, spitting out pages of warm paper. I gathered the physical evidence, stapled the corners, and slid the stack into a plain brown envelope. I tapped the envelope against the surface of my desk. I did not need a weapon to defeat the mercenary guarding my daughter. I just needed leverage. Tomorrow morning, Gage and I were going to have a very private conversation. The diner was located on the absolute edge of the industrial district, miles away from the manicured lawns and gated communities my wife frequented. It was a place that smelled permanently of old kitchen grease, strong bleach, and burnt coffee. I chose this specific location because it was entirely outside of Diana's elegant social sphere. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the only patrons were exhausted truck drivers and silent night shift workers hunched over their plates. I sat in a dimly lit corner booth facing the front door. I wore a simple gray wool sweater and a faded rain jacket. I wanted to look exactly like the harmless, clueless old man Gage believed me to be. I ordered a black coffee from a tired waitress and waited in the silence. At exactly 6:15, the bell above the glass door chimed sharply. Gage walked in. He was a massive man, built like a concrete wall, wearing a tight black tactical shirt that strained against his heavy muscles. He scanned the small room with the practiced paranoia of a professional mercenary. His eyes eventually landed on my booth. A smug, deeply condescending smile spread across his face. He walked over with a heavy, arrogant stride and slid into the cracked vinyl seat opposite me. He did not bother taking off his leather gloves. He leaned back, crossed his massive arms over his chest, and asked me what was so incredibly important that I had to call him on his personal cell phone before the sun even came up. He called me boss, but the word dripped with absolute disrespect. He clearly assumed I was there to ask him to keep a closer eye on Diana or to complain about some trivial household security issue that frightened me. He thought I was a pathetic, insecure husband begging for a favor. I let him enjoy his false sense of superiority for a few moments. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked at the dark bags under his eyes. I knew he had been up all night spending the thousands of dollars he stole from my family. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out the plain brown envelope. I placed it gently on the sticky table. I kept my hand flat on top of it. I told Gage that I had spent the last 30 years building massive commercial structures that could withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. I told him that my entire engineering career was based on finding invisible stress points and calculating exact structural failures. Gage rolled his eyes. He let out a loud theatrical sigh and asked me what structural engineering had to do with him missing his morning workout. I slid the envelope across the table. I told him to open it. Gage chuckled, shaking his head slowly as if he were dealing with a confused child. He picked up the envelope, tore the flap open, and pulled out the thick stack of papers. I watched his eyes closely. I watched the exact moment his reality shattered. The smug smile vanished from his face instantly. The color completely drained from his thick neck. His eyes darted rapidly across the printed spreadsheets, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital authorization codes. His breathing stopped. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and perfectly level. I explained the documents to him in excruciating detail. I told him I knew all about his 3 phantom security consultancy firms. I told him exactly how much money he had funneled out of the clinic's operating budget over the past 36 months. I recited the account numbers of his offshore banks purely from memory. I told him that he was a very sloppy thief. He had left a digital trail so incredibly wide that a first-year accounting student could follow it. Gage dropped the papers on the table as if they were burning his hands. His fingers were physically shaking. The arrogant mercenary, was entirely gone. A cornered, terrified animal took his place. He leaned across the table, his physical size suddenly becoming a weapon. He lowered his voice to a dangerous, violent growl. He told me that I was an old man sitting alone with him in a bad neighborhood. He told me he could break my neck before my coffee got cold, walk out the front door, and absolutely no one would stop him. I did not flinch. I did not move backward. I stared directly into his angry eyes. I told him that breaking my neck would be the absolute worst financial and legal decision of his entire life. I explained that the documents sitting on the table were just paper copies. The original encrypted files were sitting on a secure server in my locked home office. I told him I had set up an automated dead man's switch on the network. If I did not return home and manually enter a specific alphanumeric password by 9 o'clock this morning, my server would automatically email the entire digital dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, and my wife. I watched the threat of violence evaporate from his body. Gage slumped back into the vinyl booth, defeated. He knew exactly what Diana would do to him. She would not just fire him quietly. She would use her immense wealth and deep political connections to utterly destroy him. She would ensure he spent the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and corporate fraud. He was completely trapped, and he knew it. He swallowed hard. He looked around the empty diner, suddenly terrified that someone might be listening to our conversation. He looked back at me, his voice barely a whisper now. He asked me how much money I wanted to keep my mouth shut. He frantically offered to empty his offshore accounts today. He offered to transfer everything back to the clinic by the end of the week. I shook my head. I told him I did not want a single penny of his stolen money. I told him I did not care about his phantom companies or his expensive sports cars. I only wanted one thing. I laid out the strict terms of his survival. I told him that next Tuesday night, at exactly midnight, he was going to be sitting alone at the primary control console in the clinic's security hub. I told him he was going to manually initiate a system-wide diagnostic reboot of the entire surveillance network. He was going to turn off every single camera, every motion sensor, and every biometric log in the building. Gage stared at me in total confusion. He told me that a full system reboot took exactly 3 minutes to complete. During those 3 minutes, the clinic would be entirely blind and vulnerable. He asked me what I was planning to do in the dark. I told him that was none of his business. I told him his only job was to push the button at midnight, keep his mouth shut, and ensure his guards stayed in the basement break room until the system came back online. If he did exactly what I told him, I would permanently delete the blackmail files from my server. He would get to keep his stolen money, his job, and his freedom. If he refused, or if he warned Diana, I would burn his life to the ground before the sun came up tomorrow. Gage looked down at the documents on the table. He looked back at the cold, absolute resolve in my eyes. He realized he was not negotiating with a weak old man. He was taking orders from someone holding a loaded gun to his head. He slowly nodded his head. He agreed to the terms. He promised the system would go completely dark at midnight on Tuesday. I stood up from the booth. I left a $5 bill on the table to pay for my coffee. I picked up the brown envelope, folded it, and placed it back into my jacket pocket. I told Gage to enjoy the rest of his morning. I turned my back on him and walked out of the diner into the cold rain. I had successfully compromised the fortress. The inside man was secured. Now I just had to prepare for the extraction. I drove straight from the diner to an industrial supply warehouse I used to frequent before my retirement. I needed specific chemical compounds to bypass the secondary biometric lock on the inside of my daughter's cell. I knew the exact model of the retinal scanner Diana had installed. It was a military-grade piece of hardware designed to trigger an instant facility-wide lockdown if the external casing was physically breached or tampered with. I could not smash it with a hammer or pry it open with a crowbar. I had to freeze its internal logic board instantly. I purchased a pressurized cylinder of liquid nitrogen and a highly concentrated thermal conductive paste used for cooling heavy machinery. Back in the silent solitude of my garage, I carefully constructed a compact, pressurized delivery tube. I coated the brass nozzle with the thermal paste to ensure maximum heat transfer. When applied directly to the scanner's microchip housing, the sudden drop to negative 300 degrees Fahrenheit would completely shatter the internal silicon circuits without sending a warning signal or an error code to the main server. The electrical current would simply cease to exist. I packed the customized cylinder into a heavy canvas duffel bag alongside a battery-powered angle grinder, a set of titanium pry bars, and a heavy tactical flashlight. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I drove to an abandoned commercial parking garage on the desolate outskirts of the city. Bradley was already waiting for me. Parked next to his sleek luxury sedan was a pristine, fully equipped medical ambulance. It bore the bright logo of a private transit company that Bradley had legally purchased through an anonymous shell corporation just 3 hours ago. The vehicle was completely untraceable to us. 2 muscular men wearing standard paramedic uniforms were loading heavy equipment into the back. Bradley introduced them as independent security contractors. They were former combat medics who specialized in rapid, unrecorded extractions for wealthy clients in dangerous situations. They did not ask for my name. They did not ask who we were rescuing. Bradley had paid them an exorbitant amount of money to guarantee their absolute silence and their loyalty. I climbed into the back of the ambulance to inspect the setup. The interior was clinically clean and completely stocked with oxygen tanks, intravenous fluids, and advanced cardiac monitors. One of the combat medics showed me a specialized chemical neutralization drip. He explained that since Maya had been heavily and systematically sedated with synthetic opioids for an entire year, her heart rate would be dangerously low. The moment we pulled her out of that room, her body might go into shock. They had prepared a specific cocktail of adrenaline and counteracting agents to stabilize her nervous system the second she was placed on the stretcher. I looked at the empty white mattress waiting in the center of the cabin. The reality of what we were about to do hit me with full force. Tonight, my daughter was going to be lying on that bed, finally safe from the people who were slowly killing her. The sun eventually went down, casting long, dark shadows across the city skyline. The heavy rain from the morning finally stopped, leaving a thick blanket of fog rolling through the empty streets. I stood in the cold, damp parking garage with Bradley leaning over the hood of his car. We spread out a detailed architectural blueprint of the psychiatric clinic that I had drawn entirely from memory earlier that afternoon. I used a red marker to trace the exact path I would take. We synchronized our heavy mechanical watches down to the exact second. The plan required absolute flawless timing. There was zero margin for error. At exactly 11:55 tonight, the ghost ambulance would pull into the narrow alleyway directly behind the clinic's rear maintenance exit. At midnight exactly, Gage would kill the primary surveillance loop from the central control room. I would have exactly 180 seconds of total darkness. 3 minutes. I walked Bradley through the brutal mathematics of the timeline. I allocated exactly 20 seconds to pick the heavy exterior service door using my tension wrenches. I allocated 40 seconds to sprint down the basement corridor and climb the emergency stairwell to the executive floor. I gave myself exactly 30 seconds to bypass the biometric lock on my wife's office door and trigger the hidden mechanism behind the bookshelf. That left me with barely 90 seconds to freeze the retinal scanner inside the cell, carry my weakened daughter out of the concrete room, and make it back down to the waiting ambulance stretcher before the system rebooted. If I took 1 second longer than 180 seconds, the backup generators would automatically cycle. The cameras would instantly power back on, the silent alarms would trigger, and Gage's armed guards would flood the hallway with weapons drawn. We would all go to prison, and Maya would be lost forever. I looked down at the second hand sweeping smoothly across the dark face of my watch. My entire life, my career, my marriage, and my wealth had all funneled down to this single microscopic window of time. Bradley looked at me from across the hood of the car. He asked me if my hands were steady enough for this kind of pressure. I held out my right hand in the cold air. It did not tremble at all. It was as solid as stone. The terrified, grieving father was buried deep inside. The structural engineer was in complete control of my body now. I zipped up my dark jacket and slung the heavy canvas duffel bag over my shoulder. The weight of the tools felt reassuring against my back. I told Bradley to get into the passenger seat of the ambulance. The planning phase was officially over. It was time to tear the walls down. I sat in the passenger seat of the unmarked medical ambulance. The engine was completely cut. We were parked in the narrow service alleyway directly behind the rear maintenance exit of the psychiatric clinic. The thick fog rolling off the nearby river completely swallowed the vehicle, hiding us from the main street. The two combat medics sat in absolute silence in the back, checking the chemical stabilization drips one final time. I stared straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. I kept my eyes locked on the small red security camera mounted directly above the reinforced steel door of the clinic. That glowing red lens was the only thing standing between me and my daughter. I raised my left wrist and stared at the glowing dial of my mechanical watch. It was 11:58 at night. I had exactly 120 seconds until Gage initiated the system-wide blind spot. The heavy canvas duffel bag rested on my lap. I reached inside and wrapped my leather-gloved fingers around the cold metal cylinder of liquid nitrogen. The physical weight of the tools grounded me. My breathing was slow, deliberate, and entirely controlled. I was not a terrified father in this moment. I was a precise instrument of extraction. I was a structural engineer, preparing to dismantle a building from the inside out. The second hand on my watch swept past the 12. It was 11:59. I opened the heavy door of the ambulance and stepped out into the freezing, damp air. I quietly closed the door behind me, ensuring the latch clicked without a sound. I walked through the shadows of the alleyway, stopping exactly 3 feet away from the heavy steel service door. I looked up at the red security light. I waited. The silence of the alley was deafening. The seconds dragged by like hours. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I counted the final 10 seconds in my head. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Midnight. The glowing red light on the security camera instantly blinked out. The entire exterior surveillance grid went completely dark. The 3-minute countdown had officially begun. I lunged forward. I did not waste a single fraction of a second. I pulled the specialized tension wrenches from my jacket pocket and slid them directly into the heavy mechanical keyway of the service door. This was a commercial-grade deadbolt designed to withstand a sledgehammer, but I knew the exact pin configuration. I applied the exact amount of rotational pressure, feeling the heavy brass tumblers bind against the shear line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The final pin clicked into place. I threw my shoulder against the heavy steel door and pushed it open. I stepped into the dimly lit basement corridor of the clinic and let the door swing shut behind me. It locked automatically with a heavy thud. I was inside. I broke into a dead sprint. My boots hit the polished concrete floor with sharp, rhythmic thuds. The basement was a labyrinth of exposed pipes and laundry carts, but I knew the layout perfectly. I bypassed the main elevators completely. They were too slow and too exposed. I headed straight for the emergency fire stairwell, located at the far north end of the corridor. I hit the push bar on the stairwell door and threw it open. I began to climb. I had to ascend 4 flights of stairs to reach the executive wing. I am 66 years old. My lungs began to burn immediately. The muscles in my legs screamed in protest against the sudden violent exertion. But I did not slow down. I pushed the pain entirely out of my mind. The image of Maya locked in that concrete cell fueled every single step. I took the stairs 2 at a time, pulling myself up by the metal handrails to gain momentum. I reached the 4th floor landing. I checked my watch. Exactly 45 seconds had passed. I was perfectly on schedule. I pushed the heavy fire door open and stepped into the plush, carpeted hallway of the executive wing. The contrast between the cold, concrete stairwell and this luxurious corridor was jarring. The air here smelled of expensive air fresheners and polished wood. I moved rapidly down the hallway, staying close to the wall, to minimize my physical footprint. I reached the solid mahogany door of Diana's private office. The electronic biometric lock on the handle was completely dark, disabled by Gage's system reboot, but the mechanical deadbolt was still engaged. I did not have time to pick this lock. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the battery-powered angle grinder. I had modified the cutting wheel specifically for this exact scenario. I wedged the thin titanium blade into the gap between the door and the frame directly against the steel locking bolt. I squeezed the trigger. The grinder screamed to life, sending a shower of bright orange sparks flying across the dark hallway. The noise was incredibly loud, but I knew the thick acoustic paneling of the executive wing would absorb most of the sound. The specialized blade sliced through the deadbolt in less than 10 seconds. I kicked the door open and stepped into Diana's office. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint ambient light bleeding in through the large exterior windows. I did not turn on my flashlight. I moved entirely by memory. I crossed the thick Persian rug, walked around the massive oak desk, and reached out for the silver fountain pen, sitting exactly where I had left it. My fingers closed around the cold metal. I twisted the cap. The heavy mechanical gears hidden within the walls groaned to life. The massive mahogany bookshelf began to slide open. I dropped the canvas duffel bag onto the floor. I pulled out the pressurized cylinder of liquid nitrogen and gripped it tightly in my right hand. I pulled my heavy tactical flashlight from my belt with my left hand. I stood exactly at the threshold of the hidden room, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my chest. The gap widened enough for me to slip through. I stepped into the hidden cell. I raised the flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the brilliant white beam of light across the concrete box. I immediately raised the freezing cylinder toward the retinal scanner mounted on the wall, ready to shatter the internal logic board. But my hand froze in midair. The beam of my flashlight hit the small bare cot in the center of the room. The cot was completely empty. Maya was not there. The heavy leather restraints were lying unbuckled on the floor. The gray clinical scrub suit she had been wearing was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The room was totally silent. The metallic smell of fear was gone, replaced by a strong, sharp scent of industrial bleach. They had scrubbed the room clean. Panic, sharp and suffocating, seized my throat. I swung the flashlight wildly around the small space, checking every corner, desperately hoping she was just hiding in the shadows. But the room was completely bare. She was gone. I checked my watch. I had exactly 30 seconds left before the security cameras powered back on and Gage's armed guards flooded the hallway. My entire flawless plan, the extraction, the ghost ambulance, the combat medics, all of it was suddenly rendered completely useless. I had broken into a fortified vault, only to find the treasure had already been stolen. I took a step back, the crushing weight of failure threatening to drop me to my knees. As the beam of my flashlight swept back across the empty mattress, it caught the glare of something small and white resting directly in the center of the bed. I stepped closer. It was a piece of thick, expensive stationery. It was folded exactly in half. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. I flipped it open. The handwriting was elegant, perfectly spaced, and unmistakably belonged to my wife. The words written on the paper felt like a physical knife twisting directly into my heart. The note read exactly like this. I moved her. Did you honestly think I would not notice the scuff marks your shoes left on my polished floor the other day? You are a brilliant engineer, Russell, but you are a terrible liar. Your eyes gave you away the moment you walked out of my office. You think you can outsmart me in my own building. You are nothing but an old man playing a dangerous game you cannot possibly win. Go home. If you ever try to look for her again, I will not wait for her birthday. I will end this tonight." I read the words 3 times, my brain struggling to process the absolute devastation of her message. Diana had known. She had known the entire time we were drinking coffee. She had seen through my carefully constructed facade instantly. She let me walk out of the clinic thinking I had won, only to secretly relocate my daughter the second I drove away. She had played me perfectly. She was always one move ahead. I crushed the thick paper in my fist. The sound of the building's massive backup generators suddenly thrumming to life vibrated through the floorboards. The 3 minutes were up. The security system was rebooting. The red light on the retinal scanner next to me blinked on with a sharp electronic beep. I shoved the crumpled note into my pocket. I grabbed my canvas bag from the floor and bolted out of the hidden cell. I hit the switch to close the bookshelf behind me. I did not care if the cameras caught me sprinting down the hallway now. The stealth operation was completely over. The Cold War had officially ended. It was a hot war now, and Diana had just fired the opening shot. I ran toward the emergency stairwell, my mind already calculating the next move. She thought this note would terrify me into submission. She thought I would simply go home and surrender my daughter to her greed. She was completely wrong. This note was not a victory lap. It was a massive tactical error, because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The gloves were off, the illusions were shattered, and I was going to tear this city apart brick by brick until I found my child. I sprinted down the executive corridor with the heavy canvas duffel bag bouncing violently against my hip. I needed to reach the emergency stairwell before the primary security grid fully re-engaged. My boots hit the thick carpet with heavy, desperate thuds. I could hear the massive backup generators in the basement humming with increasing intensity. The 3-minute window of darkness was closing fast. Suddenly, the overhead fluorescent lights snapped on with a blinding white flash. The emergency reboot was completely finished. A loud electronic buzz echoed through the length of the hallway as the magnetic security locks on every single door instantly rearmed themselves. I reached the heavy steel door of the fire stairwell and grabbed the handle. I pulled with all my strength, but it did not move an inch. The electronic deadbolt had engaged. I was completely locked in on the 4th floor. A soft melodic chime echoed from the far end of the corridor. I turned around slowly. The polished steel doors of the private VIP elevator slid open. Cameron stepped out into the brightly lit hallway. My son-in-law was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue suit and a perfectly knotted silk tie. A smug, arrogant smile was plastered across his face. He looked entirely out of place in a psychiatric hospital at midnight. 2 massive men in black tactical uniforms stepped out of the elevator right behind him. They were Gage's private security contractors. They spread out instantly, blocking the only escape route. They both had their hands resting casually on the grips of their holstered weapons. The trap had been set perfectly, and I had walked right into it. Cameron began a slow, sarcastic clap as he walked down the hallway toward me. The sound of his clapping echoed mockingly off the acoustic walls. He stopped exactly 10 feet away, keeping his armed guards perfectly positioned between us. He looked me up and down, analyzing my sweaty forehead, my heavy breathing, and the canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder. He shook his head in mock pity. He told me I looked absolutely terrible. He said a man of my advanced age should not be running around in the dark playing action hero. He stepped a little closer but maintained a safe distance. He reminded me about the major bypass surgery I had undergone 5 years ago. He told me that my heart was already incredibly weak, and that all this unnecessary physical and emotional stress was going to trigger a fatal cardiac event. He lowered his voice into a tone of fake sympathy. He said it would be an absolute tragedy for Diana to lose her beloved husband on the exact same night her severely ill daughter was permanently transferred out of state. I stood frozen against the heavy steel door. I stared at the man who had sat at my dining table and cried fake tears over my missing daughter for an entire year. I demanded to know where Maya was. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute hatred in my tone made the two security guards tense up. Cameron let out a short, cruel laugh. He told me I really was a naive old fool. He explained that Diana had called him the exact second I walked out of her office earlier today. They knew I was suspicious. They knew I was planning some kind of rescue attempt tonight. Cameron told me they did not wait around to see what my plan was. He personally drove a private medical transport van to the clinic this afternoon through the underground garage. He revealed that Maya was no longer in the building, or even in the city. He proudly announced that Maya was currently strapped to a medical bed in the back of a private jet, sitting on the tarmac of a corporate airfield 30 miles away. He bragged that they had arranged an emergency medical flight to a highly secure offshore psychiatric facility located in the Caribbean. He smiled and said she would enjoy the beautiful ocean view from her padded room for the rest of her miserable life. The psychological blow of his words was devastating. Cameron checked the expensive gold watch on his wrist. He told me the flight was scheduled to take off in less than an hour. He explained their legal strategy with absolute arrogance. By the time the private arbitration hearing began on Tuesday morning, to seize the $15 million trust fund, Maya would be entirely outside the jurisdiction of the United States legal system. There would be absolutely nothing I or any fancy corporate lawyer could do to petition for her release or bring her back across the border. They were going to steal her inheritance and leave her to rot in a foreign prison disguised as a hospital. Cameron looked at the two armed guards standing silently beside him. He gave them a cold, calculated nod. He instructed them to handle the situation immediately. He told them to restrain me and inject me with a massive dose of synthetic adrenaline from the clinic's emergency supply. He wanted my death to look completely natural. He wanted the medical examiner to rule it a tragic consequence of an old man having a dementia-induced panic episode while trespassing in a closed medical facility. He promised the guards a massive cash bonus for their absolute discretion and efficiency. Cameron turned his back to me, preparing to walk back to the elevator. He thought the game was completely over. He thought he had completely won, and that I was just a broken old man waiting to die on the floor of a hospital corridor. But Cameron made a fatal miscalculation. He relied entirely on his hired muscle and his arrogant assumptions. He completely forgot that he was standing in a building I had personally engineered. I did not need a weapon to defeat him. I just needed to alter the environment. The two massive security guards stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements. The guard on the left reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small, clear syringe filled with synthetic adrenaline. He flicked the needle with his thick finger, preparing to inject me with a fatal heart attack. Cameron had his back turned to me, walking toward the polished steel elevator doors with total confidence. He assumed I was just a frightened old man who was about to quietly die on the carpet of a hospital corridor. He severely underestimated the mind of a structural engineer backed into a corner. I did not look at the guards. I looked at the walls. I had designed this entire executive wing 15 years ago. I knew exactly what was hidden behind the expensive acoustic paneling. Exactly 3 feet to my left was a flush-mounted brushed steel plate. It was the manual override for the clinic's catastrophic fire suppression system. I shifted my weight slightly, acting as though my legs were giving out from sheer terror. The guard with the syringe smirked and stepped closer, reaching out to grab my collar. I did not retreat. I used every ounce of strength in my 66-year-old body and swung the heavy canvas duffel bag directly upward into his face. The heavy titanium pry bars and the thick pressurized cylinder of liquid nitrogen inside the bag collided with his jaw with a sickening crunch. The guard dropped the syringe and stumbled backward, clutching his shattered face as blood poured over his hands. I dropped the heavy bag and lunged toward the wall. I drove my elbow directly into the center of the brushed steel plate. The thin glass casing shattered instantly, cutting through my jacket and slicing my forearm. I ignored the sharp pain. I shoved my bleeding hand into the cavity, punched the massive red manual override button, and twisted it exactly 90 degrees to the right, locking the circuit open. The reaction was instantaneous and violently catastrophic. The clinic's central computer registered a massive, uncontainable fire event on the executive floor. A deafening mechanical siren ripped through the corridor. The sound was so incredibly loud, it caused immediate physical pain deep inside my eardrums. Blinding white strobe lights mounted in the ceiling began flashing frantically, turning the elegant hallway into a disorienting nightmare of fractured, chaotic shadows. Then came the hiss, high-pressure nozzles hidden seamlessly in the ceiling tiles deployed all at once. Because this floor housed highly sensitive computer servers and paper medical records, the system did not use water. It used halon gas. Halon is a heavy chemical agent designed to instantly extinguish fires by violently displacing all the oxygen in the room. A thick, freezing white cloud erupted from the ceiling, blasting down onto us with the force of a hurricane. The temperature in the hallway plummeted immediately. The thick white gas swallowed the corridor, blinding everyone and rapidly starving our lungs of breathable air. Cameron let out a high-pitched scream of absolute terror. His smug, arrogant demeanor completely evaporated the second the freezing gas hit his throat. He dropped to his knees, coughing violently, completely abandoning his guards and blindly crawling toward the elevator doors like a frightened animal. The second guard was a trained professional, but no amount of military training can prepare a human body for sudden oxygen deprivation. Blinded by the frantic white strobe lights and choking on the heavy chemical fog, he panicked. He lunged blindly through the gas and tackled me around the waist. The sheer momentum of his massive body slammed my back hard against the mahogany door of my wife's office. The impact knocked the remaining air completely out of my lungs. My chest burned with a terrifying, agonizing heat. My heart pounded wildly against my ribs, screaming for oxygen that simply was not there. For a terrifying second, I thought Cameron's prediction was coming true, and my heart was going to fail right there in the dark. But the rage kept me conscious. The guard raised a heavy fist attempting to strike my head, but his movements were becoming sluggish and uncoordinated as the halon gas starved his brain. I did not try to match his brute strength. I used pure physics. I dropped my center of gravity entirely, letting my body weight pull him forward off balance. As he stumbled, I brought my heavy leather work boot down with brutal force directly onto the side of his right knee joint. The human knee is a structural pivot point not designed to handle lateral shearing force. The joint gave way with a loud, wet snap. The massive guard collapsed onto the floor, groaning in agony and gasping uselessly at the toxic air. I pushed myself away from the door. My vision was beginning to tunnel. Dark black spots danced at the edges of my sight. I knew I had less than 30 seconds of consciousness remaining before the gas rendered me completely comatose. I dropped down onto my hands and knees. Halon gas is heavier than standard atmospheric air, but in the initial turbulent release there is usually a very thin pocket of breathable oxygen trapped directly against the floorboards. I pressed my face to the carpet and took a shallow, ragged breath. It was enough to keep my brain firing. I crawled rapidly down the hallway, moving away from the elevator and toward the north wall. The sirens continued to scream their deafening warning. The strobe lights flashed relentlessly through the thick white fog. I reached the end of the corridor and ran my bleeding hands blindly along the expensive wallpaper. I was feeling for a very specific seam in the architecture. During a catastrophic fire override, the building automatically disengages the magnetic locks on the secondary ventilation access shafts to prevent hazardous pressure buildup. My fingers found the narrow groove. I pushed hard against the wall panel. It swung inward, revealing a pitch-black, narrow maintenance shaft filled with thick dust and cold, drafty air. I dragged my exhausted body over the threshold and pulled the heavy panel shut behind me. The thick acoustic walls of the shaft instantly muffled the screaming sirens and blocked the freezing halon gas. I lay on the metal grating in the pitch-black darkness, taking deep, desperate gulps of the stale, dusty air. My lungs burned, my arm was bleeding freely, and my entire body was shaking from the massive dump of adrenaline. I rested for exactly 10 seconds. I could not afford to stop. My daughter was on a runway 30 miles away, being loaded onto a private jet to be legally erased from the world. I blindly reached out and found the cold steel rungs of the maintenance ladder. I began the agonizing climb down 3 stories of total darkness. Every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through my battered muscles. I focused entirely on the mechanics of descending, placing one hand below the other, one foot below the other. I blocked out the pain. I blocked out the fear. I reached the basement level, kicked open the external exhaust vent, and spilled out into the cold, wet alleyway behind the clinic. The entire exterior of the building was flashing with bright red emergency lights. The sound of distant fire truck sirens echoed through the city streets. Gage and his entire security team would be completely paralyzed, dealing with a catastrophic chemical release on the executive floor. I stumbled through the thick fog of the alleyway, clutching my bleeding arm. The unmarked medical ambulance was idling near the street corner. Bradley threw open the side door, his face pale with shock, when he saw me emerge from the shadows, alone and covered in blood. I climbed into the back of the ambulance and collapsed onto the empty medical stretcher. I looked up at the 2 confused combat medics and told them the extraction point had changed. I gave the driver the exact coordinates of the corporate airfield and told him to drive as fast as the engine would allow. The ticking clock had not stopped. It had simply moved to the sky. The unmarked medical ambulance tore through the wet city streets. The heavy rain had started again, beating violently against the roof of the vehicle. I sat on the edge of the empty medical stretcher. My breathing was ragged and shallow. The massive spike of adrenaline that had carried me down 3 flights of stairs was rapidly burning out, leaving behind a deep, agonizing ache in my bones. One of the combat medics knelt in front of me carefully, cutting away the shredded sleeve of my dark jacket. He poured strong chemical antiseptic over the deep glass cuts on my right forearm and began wrapping it tightly with thick white gauze. I did not flinch. The physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing weight settling in my chest. Bradley sat on the opposite bench, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He had expected me to walk out of that dark alleyway, carrying my rescued daughter. Instead, he saw a battered old man, covered in blood and toxic chemical residue. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I looked Bradley directly in the eyes and told him everything that happened on the 4th floor. I told him about the empty concrete cell, the mocking note left on the bare mattress, and the perfectly timed ambush in the executive corridor. Then I told him the most devastating piece of information. I repeated the exact words my arrogant son-in-law had spoken to me before I triggered the fire alarm. I told Bradley that Cameron claimed Maya was already sitting on the tarmac of a corporate airfield 30 miles away, waiting to be flown to a highly secure offshore psychiatric facility in the Caribbean. I expected Bradley to panic. I expected the ruthless corporate litigator to throw his hands up in defeat and tell me the legal battle was officially lost and Maya was gone forever. But Bradley did not panic. He leaned his head back against the vibrating wall of the ambulance and stared at the ceiling. The brilliant analytical machinery of his mind shifted into high gear. He shook his head slowly. He told me that Cameron was an arrogant fool who did not understand the absolute reality of international aviation law. Bradley explained the brutal logistics of moving a human being across international borders against their will. You cannot simply throw a heavily sedated, unconsenting adult onto a private jet and fly to the Caribbean in the middle of the night. It requires highly specific international medical transport clearances. It requires stamped approval from federal customs agencies both domestically and at the destination country. Furthermore, Diana would need to secure a verified receiving physician at the offshore facility to legally accept the transfer of a legally incapacitated patient. Bradley looked at me with absolute certainty. He told me that filing that kind of specialized paperwork takes a minimum of 72 hours to clear through international red tape. It was legally and physically impossible for Diana to have secured an offshore flight path in the 4 hours since I left her office. The heavy fog of despair in my mind began to lift instantly. Bradley was completely right. Cameron was lying. He was trying to break my spirit so I would simply give up, believe the fight was over, and go home to wait for the end. But if Maya was not sitting on an airplane waiting for takeoff, where was she? She had to be somewhere completely isolated. She had to be somewhere Diana and Cameron possessed absolute control without the risk of curious neighbors or local police officers asking questions. I closed my eyes and forced my mind back to the pristine mahogany office in my house. I visualized the thick stack of financial ledgers I had pulled from my wife's biometric wall safe just a few hours ago. I mentally flipped through the pages of offshore bank accounts, predatory corporate loans, and fraudulent medical proxies. Then I remembered the secondary folder, the specific folder detailing Cameron's personal expenses and investments. Over the past 12 months, I had given Cameron thousands of dollars because he cried in my living room and claimed he was too depressed to maintain his job. He told me he was using the money to pay for grief therapy and keep his house from going into foreclosure. But the ledgers told a completely different story. 6 months ago, Cameron used my money to purchase a massive piece of undeveloped real estate. It was a secluded luxury investment property located high up in the northern mountain range. He claimed on his tax returns that he was going to flip the property for a massive profit. But he never hired a single contractor. He never listed it on the real estate market. It was entirely off the grid, surrounded by miles of dense pine forest, and completely inaccessible during heavy rainstorms. My eyes snapped open. I looked at Bradley and told him about the mountain property. I told him it was the only logical place on Earth. It was the only location they owned that was completely isolated from the outside world. They did not have the flight clearance to take her out of the country tonight. They needed a temporary holding cell to keep her completely hidden until the private arbitration hearing next Tuesday. They had panicked when they realized I knew about the clinic, so they moved her to the most remote location they possessed. Bradley pulled a sleek, encrypted tablet from his leather briefcase. His fingers flew across the glass screen, tapping into municipal property databases. Within 30 seconds, he pulled up the formal deed to the mountain house. He confirmed that the property was registered under an anonymous holding company, completely controlled by Cameron. He pulled up the satellite imagery. The house was a modern fortress, built into the side of a steep cliff, sitting at the end of a single treacherous dirt road. It was the perfect place to hide a kidnapped woman. I turned to the driver of the unmarked ambulance. I told him to forget the corporate airfield entirely. I gave him the exact coordinates of the mountain property. I told him we had a 2-hour drive ahead of us through winding, elevated roads. Bradley looked at the combat medics sitting in the back with us and told them to prepare their heavy equipment. We were no longer executing a stealth extraction in a brightly lit hospital. We were driving into an isolated stronghold completely controlled by desperate people who knew we were coming. I looked down at my freshly bandaged arm. The bleeding had stopped. The structural engineer had survived the trap. Now it was time to tear down the final wall. I leaned my head back against the wall of the ambulance and watched the dark city skyline fade into the distance. The ticking clock was louder than ever. We were going to the mountain, and we were not leaving without my daughter. The heavy tires of the unmarked medical ambulance tore through the flooded streets of the city, throwing massive sheets of dirty water against the concrete sidewalks. We left the glowing urban skyline completely behind us, plunging into the absolute darkness of the northern highway. The rain was coming down in solid sheets, hammering against the reinforced steel roof of the vehicle with a deafening, continuous roar. I sat on the edge of the empty medical stretcher, watching the water streak rapidly across the small rear window. Every time the heavy ambulance hit a deep puddle, the entire chassis shuddered violently, but the driver never once took his foot off the accelerator. We were pushing the massive diesel engine to its absolute mechanical limit. I looked down at the glowing dial of my mechanical watch. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. We had exactly 8 hours until the private arbitration hearing began in a downtown courtroom. 8 hours until a judge slammed a wooden gavel down and legally handed my daughter and her $15 million trust fund over to the monsters who were slowly torturing her to death. I turned away from the dark window and looked at Bradley. The ruthless corporate lawyer was sitting on the opposite bench, holding his encrypted tablet tightly in his hands. The pale blue light from the digital screen illuminated his face, highlighting the deep lines of stress and exhaustion around his eyes. He was pulling up every single piece of public data he could find regarding Cameron's mountain property. He read the structural details out loud over the roar of the engine and the beating rain. The property was a modern architectural fortress built directly into the side of a steep granite cliff. It sat at the very end of a 5-mile dirt logging road that had not been maintained or paved in several decades. Bradley tapped the screen and brought up a high-resolution satellite image of the surrounding terrain. He pointed out a massive steel security gate blocking the only entrance to the private driveway. He told me that Cameron had recently filed municipal permits to upgrade the perimeter defenses, including reinforced steel fencing and high-definition thermal motion cameras. I leaned forward and studied the satellite topography map glowing on the screen. I did not see an impenetrable fortress. I saw a series of structural vulnerabilities waiting to be violently exploited. I told Bradley that a heavy steel security gate is only as strong as the concrete anchor holding its hinges to the ground. If Cameron hired cheap local contractors to pour the foundation in the freezing mountain soil, the concrete would be incredibly brittle and highly susceptible to extreme kinetic impact. I turned to the 2 combat medics sitting quietly in the back of the ambulance with us. I asked them exactly what kind of heavy equipment they had packed in their tactical bags. The medic closest to me reached down and unzipped a massive black canvas duffel bag. He pulled out a heavy hydraulic breaching ram, typically used by elite tactical police units to crush reinforced steel barricades. He also revealed a set of high-powered thermal optic goggles and heavy ceramic ballistic vests. Bradley had not just hired standard paramedics. He had hired a fully equipped paramilitary extraction team ready for open combat. I looked at the 2 medics. I needed to make sure they completely understood the brutal reality of what we were driving into tonight. I kept my voice low and perfectly steady. I told them we were not walking into a standard medical emergency or a simple rescue mission. I told them my daughter was being held hostage by highly paid private security contractors who were heavily armed and incredibly dangerous. I explained that these men were fiercely loyal to my wife and my son-in-law, and they would not hesitate to use lethal force to protect their incredibly lucrative illegal operation. I told the medics that the element of surprise was our absolute only true advantage. We were going to hit the mountain property fast, hard, and without any prior warning. I told them that if any of Cameron's guards reached for a weapon, they had my absolute authorization to neutralize the threat by any physical means necessary. The 2 combat medics did not blink or hesitate. They simply nodded in unison and began quietly strapping on their heavy black ballistic vests over their standard paramedic uniforms. I leaned my head back against the cold metal wall of the ambulance and closed my eyes. The physical exhaustion was threatening to pull me under. My 66-year-old body was screaming for rest after the violent struggle in the clinic. My lungs still burned slightly from inhaling the toxic halon gas. My right arm throbbed painfully where the thick glass had sliced through my skin during my desperate escape, but I refused to let the fatigue win. I focused my mind entirely on the image of Maya. I pictured her frail, trembling body locked in that concrete cell. I pictured the arrogant, smug smile on Cameron's face when he told me she was going to rot in a foreign prison for the rest of her life. The pure, freezing rage burning deep inside my chest pushed the physical pain completely away. I opened my eyes and looked at my watch again. 2:00 in the morning. 7 hours remaining until the legal guillotine dropped in that courtroom. I pictured my wife Diana sleeping comfortably in our massive estate, completely confident that her flawless master plan was coming together perfectly. She thought she had completely broken me. She thought I was currently sitting in a police station, trying to explain a crazy conspiracy theory to a bored detective. She had absolutely no idea that a heavily armed extraction team was currently hurtling up a mountain road to tear her entire world apart. The ambulance suddenly lurched violently as the smooth asphalt of the highway abruptly ended. We hit the unpaved mountain logging road. The ride became incredibly rough, throwing us forcefully against the padded walls of the cabin. The driver shifted the heavy vehicle into four-wheel drive and began the treacherous ascent up the mountain. The dirt road was barely wide enough for the ambulance, with a sheer rock wall towering on one side and a terrifying drop into absolute blackness on the other. Thick mountain fog rolled heavily across the dirt path, reducing our visibility to almost zero. The relentless rain turned the loose dirt into thick, slippery mud. The massive diesel engine roared loudly as the heavy tires fought desperately for traction against the steep incline. We climbed higher and higher into the desolate wilderness, leaving the civilized world entirely behind us. This was a place where the law simply did not exist. This was a place where money and violence dictated the truth. We drove in incredibly tense silence for another 45 minutes. The only sounds in the cabin were the grinding of the transmission, the relentless beating of the storm, and the steady breathing of the combat medics. Finally, the driver tapped the brakes, and the ambulance came to a slow, crawling halt. He turned around in his seat and looked at us through the small, sliding partition window. He told us we had reached the absolute end of the public access road. He pointed silently through the rain-streaked windshield. I stood up and looked directly over his shoulder. 50 yards ahead, emerging like a ghost from the thick white fog, was a massive wall of reinforced steel bars. It was the primary security gate. Beyond the gate, sitting high on a rocky ridge overlooking the dark valley, was a sprawling modern house built of dark wood and heavy stone. Every single window in the massive structure was completely dark. It looked like a silent predatory beast waiting patiently in the shadows. I turned back to the cabin. Bradley slid his encrypted tablet into his thick leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. The polished corporate lawyer was completely gone. He looked at me with cold, hardened eyes, ready to witness the absolute destruction he had helped orchestrate. The two combat medics stood up and racked the heavy charging handles on their hydraulic breaching tools. They handed me a thick Kevlar vest. I slipped it over my head and pulled the heavy Velcro straps tight against my chest. The solid weight of the body armor felt right. I grabbed my canvas bag filled with my heavy engineering tools and slung it over my shoulder. I looked at the digital clock mounted on the ambulance dashboard. It was 3:15 in the morning. We had exactly 5 hours and 45 minutes to break into a fortified fortress, locate my daughter, eliminate the armed guards, and drive all the way back down the mountain to the downtown courthouse. The margin for error was absolutely zero. The time for planning and deductive reasoning was completely over. It was time to execute the final phase. I reached out and grabbed the heavy metal handle of the rear ambulance door. I pushed it open and stepped out into the freezing mountain storm. The heavy oak clock on the wall of the downtown courthouse clicked perfectly to 9:00 in the morning. The private arbitration room was completely silent. It was a space designed for absolute discretion, smelling of polished mahogany and expensive leather. The morning sun filtered through the tall, frosted glass windows, casting a soft white glow over the long conference table. The violent rainstorm from the previous night had completely passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear morning. Inside this quiet room, the final stage of a massive financial execution was quietly taking place. Diana sat perfectly straight in a high-backed leather chair. She wore a conservative dark gray designer suit that projected an image of absolute professional authority and deep maternal sorrow. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, elegant clasp. She had completely masked the panic she must have felt when Gage called her earlier to report the catastrophic fire alarm at the clinic. She was a master of psychological compartmentalization. Right now, she was playing the role of her life. Sitting directly next to her was Cameron. He looked appropriately devastated. He wore a slightly wrinkled suit and had intentionally skipped shaving that morning to give himself the appearance of a husband who had not slept in days. He kept his hands clasped tightly on the polished table, staring down at the wood grain, as if the emotional weight of the proceedings was simply too much for him to bear. Sitting across from them, at the head of the table, was the presiding judge. He was an older, distinguished man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He was known for being thorough, but he was also human and heavily influenced by the pristine public reputation my wife had built over the decades. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive stack of forged medical evaluations and legal proxies resting in front of him. Diana reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. She dabbed carefully at the corners of her eyes, ensuring she did not ruin her subtle makeup. She took a deep, shaky breath and began to speak. Her voice was a masterful performance. It was soft, trembling slightly with perfectly calculated grief. She told the judge that this was the darkest day of her entire life. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the supposed mental collapse of our daughter. She claimed that Maya had completely lost touch with reality, suffering from severe paranoid delusions and violent tendencies. Diana spoke about how she had tried everything within her medical power to save her. She lied with absolute conviction, describing countless sleepless nights and expensive experimental treatments that had all tragically failed. Cameron leaned forward, rubbing his eyes to simulate tears. He picked up the narrative perfectly. He told the judge that his wife had become a complete stranger to him. He described completely fabricated incidents where Maya supposedly attacked him and tried to set their house on fire. He said it broke his heart to admit it, but he could no longer keep her safe on his own. He stated that turning to his mother-in-law and utilizing her secure psychiatric facility was the only way to keep Maya from accidentally killing herself. The judge listened to their lies with deep sympathy. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with genuine pity for the wealthy doctor and the heartbroken husband. He looked at the final page of the legal petition. Diana lowered her voice to a broken whisper. She told the judge about the $15 million trust fund that was scheduled to unlock on the 30th birthday of our daughter next week. She shook her head sadly, calling the money a dangerous catalyst. She claimed that if Maya gained access to that kind of wealth in her current psychotic state, she would immediately fall victim to predators or use the funds to completely destroy herself. Diana looked directly into the eyes of the judge and delivered the final fatal lie. She told him she did not want the money. She claimed that taking legal control of the trust was a heavy, agonizing burden. She promised the court that every single penny would be placed into a locked medical account used exclusively to fund lifelong care in a specialized offshore facility. She asked the judge to grant her permanent legal and financial guardianship, not as a doctor, but as a desperate mother trying to save her only child. The judge let out a heavy sigh. He closed the thick leather binder containing all their forged evidence. He looked at Diana and offered his deepest condolences for her tragic family situation. He told her that he admired her strength and her unwavering dedication to the medical needs of her daughter. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy gold pen. He uncapped it and smoothed out the final legal decree on the mahogany table. The trap was perfectly set, and the judge was completely ready to spring it. At exactly 9 in the morning, the heavy mahogany doors of the arbitration room clicked shut. The sound echoed in the quiet space, sealing me inside with the two people who were actively trying to steal my life. Across the polished wooden table sat my mother Diana and my brother Cameron. They had dressed perfectly for the occasion. Diana wore a muted beige dress, a stark contrast to the flashy designer outfits she usually paraded around the city in. She had even applied her makeup to look exhausted, complete with dark shadows under her eyes. Cameron wore a conservative navy suit, his posture radiating the false concern of a protective older brother. The arbitrator took his seat at the head of the table. He was an older man, with gentle features, exactly the kind of audience Diana knew how to manipulate. Before the session even officially began, my mother pulled a plain white tissue from her purse and pressed it delicately to the corner of her eyes. It was a masterful performance. If I had not spent the last 3 months gathering evidence of their deceit, I might have felt sorry for her myself. The arbitrator asked Diana to state her reasons for requesting immediate financial guardianship. My mother took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked at the arbitrator with eyes full of fake, unshed tears and began to weave a narrative of pure fiction. She spoke in a trembling voice, painting a picture of a tragic and unstable daughter who was rapidly losing her grip on reality. She claimed my mental health had deteriorated severely since my father passed away. She spun a story about how I was squandering the inheritance he left me on wild delusions and erratic purchases. According to her, I had alienated the only family members who truly cared about me, refusing to answer their calls or let them into my home. She wiped her eyes again, whispering that it broke a mother's heart to see her own flesh and blood descend into madness. She said she only wanted to take control of my finances to protect me from myself before I ended up destitute on the streets. Cameron did not miss his cue. He leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on our mother's shoulder. He spoke with a deep, solemn tone, playing the role of the reluctant but responsible son. He told the arbitrator that they had tried everything to help me privately. He claimed they had offered to pay for therapy and had tried to gently guide my financial decisions, but I had responded with aggression and paranoia. He then slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany table. Inside that folder were the documents they had spent weeks fabricating. Cameron claimed they were unpaid medical bills, past due notices, and bank statements showing reckless withdrawals. He pointed to a specific page alleging I had transferred thousands of dollars to unknown offshore accounts. I sat perfectly still, listening to them build a cage out of calculated lies. I remembered how just 2 weeks ago I had found the hidden emails on Cameron's computer. Those emails proved he had bankrupted his own tech startup and was drowning in nearly $1 million of debt. Diana had co-signed his massive loans, putting her own luxury condo at risk of foreclosure. They did not want to protect my future. They desperately needed my inheritance to save themselves from total financial ruin. The arbitrator flipped through their fraudulent documents, his expression softening with sympathy. Diana recognized the shift in his demeanor and leaned in for the final blow. She reached across the table, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. She begged the arbitrator to grant the emergency guardianship today. She insisted that every day I maintained control over my accounts was another day I marched closer to irreversible disaster. She painted herself as the selfless martyr, willing to take on the heavy burden of managing my estate solely out of unconditional maternal love. I watched them both. Not a single muscle in my face twitched. I did not interrupt, and I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I knew that reacting with anger would only play directly into their narrative that I was unstable. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry and call them liars. That would have given them the exact proof of erratic behavior they needed to win their case. Instead, I let the silence stretch out after Diana finished her tearful plea. The arbitrator finally turned his gentle gaze toward me, asking if I had anything to say in response to these serious allegations. I took a slow, measured breath. I reached down to the leather briefcase resting by my feet. It was time to show them that the naive, broken daughter they thought they were trapping had actually been building a trap of her own. I pulled out my own stack of documents, ready to dismantle their entire charade piece by piece. The heavy silence in the room finally broke when the judge let out a long, weary sigh. He looked at Diana with eyes full of deep, profound pity. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and leaned forward, folding his hands, resting them squarely on top of the fraudulent files Cameron had provided. He spoke with a soft, measured tone, telling my mother that he completely understood her terrible pain. He praised her for making such a difficult, agonizing choice out of what he called a mother-pure, unconditional love. Every word of sympathy he offered her felt like a shovel digging my grave deeper and deeper into the cold earth. He truly believed he was saving a troubled young woman from ruining her own life. Diana lowered her head in a perfect, immaculate display of humble, tragic acceptance. She reached out and placed her manicured hand over Cameron's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze of solidarity. But from where I sat, I could clearly see the corner of her mouth twitch upwards. It was the faintest shadow of a smirk, a fleeting, momentary look of absolute triumphant greed that only a daughter who knew her true nature could recognize. She was mere seconds away from securing total legal control over my life and the $15 million my father had entrusted solely to me. She could already taste the sweet victory. She could already imagine the luxury vacations, the cleared debts, and the absolute terrifying power she would hold over my daily existence. To her, I was no longer a human being. I was simply an obstacle that had finally been removed. The judge shifted his attention to the final document sitting right at the center of his massive oak desk. It was the emergency guardianship decree, a single piece of typed paper that would legally declare me mentally incompetent and hand the keys to my entire world over to the woman who had spent months meticulously plotting my downfall. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. The sharp metallic sound of him removing the cap echoed in the quiet room, like a gunshot marking the end of my freedom. My lawyer sat rigidly beside me, holding his breath, waiting desperately for my signal to object. But I remained perfectly still. I needed them to firmly believe they had won. I needed them to commit entirely to their malicious lie before I tore their entire world down. The judge brought the gold tip of the pen down toward the thick black signature line at the bottom of the page. He paused for just a fraction of a second, hovering right above the paper. He looked up at me one last time, offering a tight, regretful smile. He told me that this decision was strictly for my own good, and that one day I would look back and understand why they had to do this. Diana let out a soft, theatrical sob of relief, pressing her white tissue to her face one more time to hide her greedy, expanding smile. The pen finally touched the paper. A small, dark dot of black ink bled into the crisp, white fibers. That was the exact moment the metal clasps of my briefcase snapped open. Just as the black ink from the pen of the judge began to stain the white paper, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the arbitration room swung open with a massive, echoing thud. The sudden noise was so loud and unexpected that the judge violently jerked his hand back, leaving a sharp, jagged streak of ink across the signature line. The emergency guardianship decree was ruined. Diana whipped her head around, and her perfectly constructed mask of tragic sorrow was instantly replaced by a scowl of pure, fiery annoyance. She had expected to see a clumsy court clerk interrupting her long-awaited moment of absolute triumph. Instead, the color completely drained from the flawless face of my mother, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. Walking through those tall wooden doors with his head held high was Russell. My mother had spent the last 2 months completely convinced that Russell was permanently out of the picture. She had paid thousands of dollars to shady private investigators to ensure he was falsely implicated in a corporate embezzlement scandal. Her goal had been to entirely discredit the one man who actually knew the truth about the estate of my father. Cameron had even bragged about running Russell out of town just 3 days ago, thinking he had eliminated my only remaining ally. Yet here Russell was, standing tall and completely unharmed. He wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, and his eyes locked onto Diana with a cold, piercing intensity that made her shrink back into her padded leather chair. The smug, triumphant smirk that had been dancing on her lips just seconds before entirely collapsed. Her hands began to tremble so violently that she had to grip the polished edge of the mahogany table to steady herself. But the terrifying reality was only just beginning to unfold for my mother and brother. Right behind Russell stepped Bradley. Cameron let out a sharp, audible gasp the very moment he saw him. Bradley was the senior forensic auditor for the exact same bank Cameron claimed had issued those massive fraudulent loans in my name. Cameron had spent weeks meticulously forging the signature of Bradley on dozens of fake financial statements to convince the court that I was recklessly draining my inheritance. Seeing the real Bradley standing in the flesh right in the middle of the room completely shattered the carefully constructed illusion of Cameron. I watched as Cameron instinctively pushed his chair back, and his eyes darted wildly toward the heavy exit doors like a panicked, trapped animal. He knew instantly that every single piece of paper inside his thick manila folder was about to be exposed as a calculated, malicious forgery. Then I finally made my entrance. I stepped out from the shadowy hallway and walked directly into the bright fluorescent light of the arbitration room. I was not alone. Flanking me on either side were two towering federal marshals wearing dark tactical uniforms and stern, uncompromising expressions. The silver badges pinned to their chests caught the bright overhead lights flashing with undeniable legal authority. The heavy rhythmic sound of our boots hitting the polished hardwood floor echoed through the dead silence of the room like the steady, relentless beat of a war drum. The absolute shock and terror that washed over my family was a picture I will remember for the rest of my life. The jaw of Diana dropped open in silent, paralyzing horror. She had spent the entire morning painting me as a fragile, unstable lunatic who was completely incapable of managing her own daily life. Yet here I stood, radiating calm, absolute, undeniable control. I did not look like the broken, tragic victim she had described to the judge. I looked like a woman who had just checkmated her greedy opponents in a high-stakes game they did not even realize they were playing. I had spent weeks working in total secret with Russell and Bradley, turning their own lies into the very evidence needed to destroy them. The judge sat completely frozen behind his massive oak desk, and his expensive gold pen hovered uselessly in the empty air. He looked from the fake documents scattered in front of him to the armed federal marshals standing securely by my side. The entire atmosphere of the room had shifted violently in a matter of seconds. The predator had suddenly become the helpless prey. I walked straight up to the mahogany table and looked down at my mother. I did not scream, and I did not shed a single tear. I simply smiled a cold, empty smile as I watched the terrifying realization wash over her. She finally understood that her perfect, malicious plan had not just failed miserably. It had successfully led federal authorities directly to her own doorstep. The trap had been flawlessly sprung, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. The room was completely silent as I took my first slow, deliberate steps toward the massive oak desk of the judge. I did not raise my voice or utter a single angry word. I did not need to scream or cry to make my absolute authority felt in that confined space. The heavy boots of the federal marshals echoed right behind me, creating a steady, relentless rhythm of impending doom for the two people who had tried to destroy me. I reached into my dark leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound folder sealed with the bright red official stamp of an independent medical laboratory. I placed it gently right on top of the ruined emergency guardianship decree. I calmly informed the judge that he was looking at a comprehensive toxicology report taken just one single hour ago. I explained that the results proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that I had been subjected to severe and systematic poisoning over the past 6 months. The heavy, deliberate doses of toxic heavy metals and synthetic hallucinogens were the true and only cause of my supposed mental instability. Every single erratic episode and every moment of paranoia had been chemically induced by the very woman sitting across the room. The judge grew incredibly pale as his eyes scanned the undeniable medical evidence presented before him. He realized with absolute horror that he had almost aided in a slow and agonizing murder under the false guise of legal protection. Before he could even fully process the terrifying reality of the medical report, I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a second thick black binder. I placed it squarely on his desk and explained that these were the personal shadow ledgers of my mother. I told him they contained meticulously detailed records of every single hidden offshore account she had opened to conceal the massive amounts of money she was illegally siphoning from the estate of my father. The crisp pages also held the exact transaction receipts, showing her direct payments to the shady private investigators who had falsely framed Russell. Furthermore, the ledgers carefully documented every single cash bribe she had paid to corrupt medical professionals to forge my terrible psychiatric evaluations. The judge slowly looked up from the damning documents, and his previously gentle and sympathetic demeanor completely vanished into thin air. He stared at Diana and Cameron with a look of absolute profound disgust. He immediately turned his head to the quiet court stenographer sitting in the corner and formally ordered the immediate issuance of federal bench warrants for both Diana and Cameron. He clearly stated that the severe charges included attempted murder and massive financial fraud, along with a deeply calculated conspiracy to commit perjury in a federal court. The legal guillotine had officially dropped and severed their future. There was absolutely no way for either of them to escape the devastating, crushing consequences of their own boundless, arrogant greed. The very moment the judge uttered the words, "Federal bench warrants," the fragile, false courage of Cameron completely evaporated into the cold air of the room. He physically collapsed back into his leather chair, trembling uncontrollably, like a terrified child who had just been caught in a massive lie. Heavy beads of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance and soaking the collar of his expensive navy suit. He realized his entire world was completely collapsing around him, and his instinct for pure selfish survival immediately took over his mind. He violently turned his back on his mother and pushed his chair away from her as if she were carrying a highly contagious and deadly disease. He looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes and began to beg for my forgiveness in a high-pitched, pathetic voice that echoed loudly in the quiet space. He claimed he had absolutely no idea about the systematic chemical poisoning or the hidden offshore shadow ledgers. He shamelessly threw the woman who had coddled and protected him his entire life directly under the bus, hoping it would save him from federal prison. He swore over and over again that he was just a helpless, innocent pawn who had been ruthlessly manipulated by a greedy and controlling mother. He pleaded with me to remember our happy childhood memories and begged me to tell the armed federal marshals that he was completely innocent of the darkest charges. I stood perfectly still and simply stared down at his pathetic, trembling form. I felt absolutely no pity or sadness for the cowardly man who had gleefully planned to lock me away in a secure psychiatric facility just to clear his own massive gambling debts. Instead of answering his desperate, chaotic pleas, I slowly raised my left hand so everyone in the room could clearly see it. I used my right thumb and index finger to smoothly slide the heavy diamond wedding ring off my finger. It was the expensive ring given to me by the husband who had secretly conspired with my family the entire time. I placed the cold metal ring onto the polished mahogany table and firmly slid it across the smooth surface toward the nearest federal marshal. I calmly stated that the ring was a vital piece of physical evidence proving a massive coordinated conspiracy that included my own husband. Cameron watched the shiny ring slide across the table and finally understood that my mercy was completely empty. The federal marshals wasted absolutely no time moving in on their assigned targets. One of the tall, heavily armed officers stepped directly behind my mother and firmly grasped her delicate wrists, pulling them roughly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely into place echoed loudly across the completely silent arbitration room. That single mechanical sound permanently shattered the pristine, flawless image Diana had spent her entire adult life carefully curating for the wealthy elite of the city. Her expensive, tailored designer dress became terribly wrinkled, and her perfectly styled hair fell into a messy, chaotic tangle around her pale, terrified face. She was no longer the elegant, wealthy, grieving mother she had pretended to be just a few short moments ago. She was nothing more than a common captured criminal facing the absolute devastating end of her luxurious freedom. She completely lost whatever tiny shred of emotional composure she had left in her body. She began to struggle wildly and violently against the unbreakable iron grip of the federal marshal. Her eyes darted frantically around the room until they finally landed on the calm face of Russell. Her voice cracked into a desperate, shrill scream as she demanded to know how an old, broken, discarded man had possibly managed to outsmart her brilliant, flawless financial plan. She spat vile, venomous insults at him, completely unable to comprehend that she had been utterly defeated by someone she considered entirely beneath her notice. Russell stood perfectly calm near the heavy wooden doors, with his hands resting easily in the pockets of his tailored charcoal suit. He did not gloat or raise his voice to match her hysterical screaming. He simply looked at her with cold, unwavering pity that cut deeper than any angry insult ever could. He told her in a low, steady, measured voice that she had made the fatal, arrogant mistake of confusing cruelty with actual intelligence. He quietly explained that she had built her entire fraudulent empire on a fragile foundation of rotten lies and brutal emotional manipulation. He delivered his final cold words to her, stating that he did not have to work very hard to destroy her perfect life. He simply understood exactly where to tap the foundation to make her corrupt, fragile structures completely collapse under their own heavy, unbearable weight. The federal marshals forcefully escorted my screaming, angry mother and my sobbing, trembling brother out of the arbitration room. I did not bother to turn around and watch them leave my life forever. I simply picked up my dark leather briefcase and gave a polite, respectful nod to the thoroughly stunned judge sitting behind his massive oak desk. Russell gently placed a warm, comforting hand on my shoulder, and together we walked slowly out of the suffocating mahogany room. We moved silently down the long, quiet marble corridors of the federal courthouse, leaving the absolute total wreckage of my greedy family far behind us. We pushed through the heavy glass exit doors and finally stepped out into the bright, warm morning light of the busy city. The cold, crisp morning air filled my lungs, and for the very first time in my entire adult life, I felt completely, entirely free from their toxic control. The intricate, clever trap had been flawlessly sprung, and my stolen wealth was permanently safely secured. The vicious enemies who had tried to bury me alive were entirely ruined, and their dark, evil influence was gone forever. The chaotic, terrifying nightmare was finally over, and perfect natural order was permanently, beautifully restored to my life. The greatest lesson I learned from this terrifying ordeal is that blood does not automatically make someone family. Real family is strictly built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and unconditional love. I learned the hard way that you should never sacrifice your own well-being simply to keep toxic people comfortable, even if those people are your own mother and brother. Furthermore, I discovered that absolute silence is never a sign of weakness. Sometimes staying quiet and closely observing the selfish greed of others is the most powerful weapon you can possibly wield. It gave me the perfect opportunity to gather my strength, build my impenetrable defense, and ultimately reclaim my entire life from those who sought to destroy it. If you found value in this story of justice and survival, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons.